right, welcome to U.S. history. Today we're doing an intro to the concept of history, what history is, what it is not, how it is created, and how it's used. So I first want to start in this intro to U.S. history with clarifying what the word history means, or how we're using the word history in this case, right? And so history can be used in a lot of different ways, right? You want to clear your history from your browser. But here, when we're talking about this academic subject, I want to clarify that history is not the past. They are not synonymous. They are not the same thing, right? So we want to first clarify that when we're talking about the past, this concept of the past, and of course we can break this apart to many levels. If we're thinking about time and reality and our perception of this, it can get really deep real quick, right? But to simplify, we can say when we're talking about the past, we usually are referring to things that have already happened, everything that has actually happened. So if we take the totality of the past, right, it's everything, every moment, every second, for every human being on Earth, and even for non-human beings, right? For the Earth itself, and we can go beyond that to the universe, right? Everything that's actually ever happened, whether or not it was written about, whether or not we still know about it, it's the past, right? It's time that has come before us, if we're thinking about time in a linear way. That's not the same as history. History, instead, is a term we use for the bodies of knowledge about the past. And this has been produced usually by historians, but we can also sometimes look at, like, for example, oral histories that are the telling of the past from a particular person who was there on the ground or who has learned about it. But whenever anyone is telling a story about something, we have to recognize that it's an interpretation of what has happened in the attempt to create understanding. And so the average person, the untrained historian, can tell a history of their life. But that's, of course, from their perspective. And if you asked other people who lived through the same events as them, they may have a different story. Each of those stories is a history. When we're talking about history as an academic subject, that history is usually produced by historians, people who have been trained to pull together information from stories to create a larger narrative that gives people some kind of understanding of what happened in the past. This quote, I think, sums it up pretty well, right? In stressing this point, history is a matter of interpretation. Individual scholars rescue particular stories from the flurry of human experience, organize them into patterns, and offer arguments to suggest how these reflected or reshaped human society at given moments. In other words, historians are story makers, right? They take the stories told by people and by artifacts from the past, and they pull them together to create a story that is organized and interpreted enough in order for people to grasp what may have happened in the past. So, I've been teaching history for a long time, both in the public school and colleges and universities. And no matter what level of people I'm teaching at, I get posed this question. There are people who ask me this question: why study history? What does it matter? It's done. It's, unimportant, irrelevant to the present. Well, I beg to differ. Just like people cannot be taken at face value of where they stand today alone, just like people are the kind of result of all the things that they have done, seen, experienced, lived through, thought, felt in the past, right? So we can also say about societies, about nations, about peoples, about cultures. And so in order to understand anything today, we have to ask the question, well, how did this come to be? Why are these people like this? Why does the government do this? Why are people angry about this or that, right? So we need to study history to understand why things are the way they are. Again, just like my analogy with an individual person, right? If you say somebody is a grouch all the time, they're always mean, they are aggressive, you want to ask, why are they like that? What happened to you, right? You want to understand the origins of whatever issue or way of being a person has, right? The same is true when we're talking about history. In order for us to understand the way things are, the way that things are today, whether that be in a community, a society, a nation, like I said. But additionally, we don't only want to understand logically, right? Whether we realize it or not, or whether people are willing to accept it or not, we are highly emotional creatures. And those emotions help us connect with other people. And that connection with other people is absolutely vital for human survival. As much as we live in an individualistic society today, the reality is that nobody does it on their own. Nobody can do it on their own. And humans are not built to do it on their own. So much of our wiring is intended for us to make connections with other people in order to promote our survival. Okay? So, if we can understand why things are the way they are, why a certain group of people is having a certain reaction, why a certain group of people have taken a certain action towards another group of people, why some groups of people may need more resources and support than others, right? What experiences people have, and understanding that helps us build empathy. And again, this is vital for human survival. When we build empathy, what empathy means is that you can get a sense of what someone else has experienced. It's different from sympathy, where you feel pity for someone or you feel bad for them, but you're removed from understanding their situation. Empathy is where you can put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand where they're coming from. And then by putting yourself in someone else's shoes, then you can kind of jump out of your tunnel vision of your own experience and then open your mind to why things that seemed incomprehensible, like why would they do that, right? Then you can kind of think, okay, well, I can get it. I can see, I've experienced this emotion, and I can understand that sometimes you do things that are not comprehensible to other people. So when we're talking about empathy, you can't exactly put yourself in the shoes of somebody who lived like 500 years ago, halfway around the world, in a totally different society. You don't really know what that's like. However, if you read the experiences of people and you try to understand the systems that they lived in and what actions and what events impacted them, then you can usually sift through and find some common denominator. So maybe I don't know what it was like to live as a slave in the Roman Empire, right? However many hundreds of years ago. But I can perhaps tap into the sense of helplessness, or the sorrow of being separated from my family, or the anger at injustice. Because those are kind of universal things that you can experience in many different situations. And if you can find that common denominator with people you think you have nothing in common with, whether in the past or even in the present, if you can learn the experiences or the histories of other people, then you can sometimes sift through to the common denominator. Well, geez, if I was in that situation, I wouldn't like this to happen to me, or I can understand why they would act this way, or I would probably need this or that, right? So it helps build that connection. And in building that connection, if you have an emotional connection or a experiential connection, or you can find some way to comprehend another group of people, another experience that is not yours, right? It opens your mind to understanding different perspectives, both in the past, about the past, in the present, about the present, and about the future. And in being able to understand different perspectives, you then are able to once again connect with other people, but you're more willing to then negotiate, compromise, work with other people, as opposed to what we have increasingly, but has also happened throughout the past, when you cannot connect with another group of people, you then, it's a slippery slope into dehumanizing them, meaning making them seem less human than you are. Those people, they're breaking the law. Those people, why would they do that? Those people are scum. Those people are horrible. Those people are monsters. Those people are worthless. Those people are lazy. Whatever labels we put on another group of people, when we start to separate them from our own experience, it's very easy to make them less human than we are. Right? That's a very slippery slope and a dangerous thing that has led to many horrible things in history. We want to understand forces that shape societies and individual lives. Right? We have to understand that we don't live in a vacuum, meaning we don't live in a situation where we are not impacted by the things that are happening around us. And that can be on the immediate level of the people directly around us, or the structures that we interact with every day, like the school system, the city, government, the media. And then we can pan out and see those things as parts of larger structures that are operating, within our state, within our country, within our continent, within our world. And that helps us then be able to see how limited our actual freedom or ability may be, but also how connected we are to other people that are being impacted by the same systems. And then if we look through, if we study history, and we can see how those systems develop, how they have impacted people through time, we can then draw a line between us and others. We can study the legacy of something. We can see how things, there's really nothing new under the sun, right? Everything that's happened in our lifetime has happened in other people's lifetimes in one way or another. It may not be exactly the same. We may be dealing with certain kinds of technologies people in the past never had, but other people had to deal with new technologies, whether it be like the wheel or the refrigerator or the car or whatever it was. There were things that people had to adapt to. And we can learn from how people did those things right or wrong, or what the outcomes of ways that people addressed these things in the past, to learn about how we should exist today. We also have to acknowledge that history is a tool. History is a very powerful tool, and that's why people argue about what's in the history books and which monuments to put up and who gets to write the story about something. History is powerful. Who gets to tell the story of what happens means they get to choose how the story is told, who is included, who is left out, who is decided as the winners, who are the people that are right or wrong, right? Who deserves what, and so on. And so those are big themes that we'll talk about in this class. So how is history written? So when we're talking about historians writing history, essentially historians study and analyze sources of information, evidence, to construct arguments about the past. Now, a lot of times there's this sense that historians are being objective. I'm just looking at the facts. I'm just putting this together. This is also true with like scientists, for example, like being objective, meaning you're not putting your opinion in it. You're just looking at the facts. But to say that, for anyone to say that they are fully objective is a cautionary thing you should beware, because nobody is fully objective. Everyone is biased by what they have lived through, who they are, what they've been taught, right? And so people need to be aware that when they are studying history, when they are studying evidence, when they're putting together a study, that they're bringing things with them that color how they view the evidence and how they tell the story. So whenever you're reading something that, especially something that is nonfiction, and you're getting information from it, so like news, history, scientific reports, it's a good idea to take a look at who's doing the writing, who's funding the writing, what organizations they're coming from, and who are supporting what's being produced. And this is something I didn't know. Nobody explicitly taught me this. It was not until I got to grad school, and I'm talking when I was in my PhD program, and sitting around in a room, a graduate studies class with like 10 other students and the professor. And at that point, you know, in graduate school, you're being assigned for each class a book to read a week. So we're about to read this book, and the professor says, okay, so what can we say about what do we know about the author? Right? And somebody says, oh, well, I saw that they have have a background in anthropology, and so I see that colors the way that they have written this history. And I was blown away. I had never thought about taking a look at who the author was and Googling their background and what organizations they came from and so on. Now, I say that to say not that, anyone's gender, race, background can exclude them from writing any history, but you just have to be aware. And the author themselves, so let's say you have a man writing women's history, or you have a white person writing African American history. That's fine, but that person has to be able to acknowledge that based on their kind of outsider position, right, or their position in society, they may bring certain assumptions and biases to what they are writing. And they should also take the effort to become introspective and wonder, okay, so what am I bringing to the table? What have I assumed about this history that I'm writing? What have I assumed? Beyond that, you can also think about what is the agenda that person might have in writing writing anything that is supposed to be considered objective, right? We have to be just be aware of people who say, like, I'm not biased, or I'm just reporting the facts on this. Which facts you choose to report are colored by who you are, what perspectives you bring into it, who you choose to interview, whose stories you choose to highlight. So if we think about, which school somebody comes from, and they're writing a book, right? Who were your advisors, and how did your advisors steer you, and what were their agendas? Do they personally have some kind of stake in it? And you're thinking even about scientific studies, and I used to think, oh, scientific studies, well, we got facts here. The scientific study, the facts in the study show this or that. But then you have to ask questions, well, who's funding the study? Is it a pharmaceutical company? And might that funding, even though the scientists who are doing the study may want to be as objective as possible, if they come up with a finding in the study that may make the funders of the study look bad, are they going to be more hesitant in coming forward with that because their funding might be pulled, right? So these are questions you have to think about, like where, who is writing what I'm reading, right? And I know that they can't be objective, but how much do they recognize for themselves and are upfront in recognizing that they have biases? So we have to be aware that when we're talking about history, there can be many histories written about the same exact time period, event, person, because different historians select different stories, organize them into different patterns, and arrive at contrasting interpretations of the same period of time or event, or the same event. Excuse me, there's a typo there. So if you think about, different historians can write about the Civil War in totally different ways. One historian might say, okay, I'm going to write about the Civil War, and I'm going to focus on the generals of both the Union and the Confederacy, and I'm going to write the story from that perspective. Well, that's going to be a very different story than if you choose to write the story from the perspective of, let's say, the Cherokee Nation, who overwhelmingly fought on the side of the Confederacy. Well, what were their motivations, and what did they have to lose, and what were they fighting for? Versus a story about the Civil War from the perspective of enslaved women and children who were running away in the midst of war in hopes of getting their freedom. It's all about the same event. But who you choose to write from the perspective of, who you choose to focus on, which stories you choose to include is going to greatly shape the narrative you produce. And so if you say, oh, I read a book on the Civil War, that's not enough for you to know what the Civil War was. You have to ask the questions about, what was the intent of this book? Whose stories are included in this? And so that takes us to something called epistemology. Epistemology is a field of study, and it's a field of study essentially about knowledge. Epistemologists ask the question, how do you know what you know? Right? It's a field of study of understanding how people acquire knowledge, and then how people get invested in believing that that knowledge is truth. Okay? So all the things you can think about, all the things you think you know for sure, right? And again, this is also a slippery slope, right? You can start getting into like really abstract things. You can get into spiritual realm. You can get into conspiracy theories. You can get into all kinds of stuff, which is not bad, right? But you do need to ask questions. You need to ask questions, especially about the things that you have taken for granted. And so when people hear that term, oh, taken for granted, it means, we often think like, I'm being taken for granted, meaning someone's not treating you well, right? Or appreciating you. But really what it means when something is taken for granted is you just assume that it is. That's why when you say someone is taking you for granted, they just assume you're going to be there. It's granted that you're going to be there. But we also can take knowledge for granted. We can say, well, yeah, of course. The sky is blue. Like whatever it is, right? But people often take things for granted about history because you've been taught this. It's been reinforced by movies, television, textbooks, teachers, parents, church, whatever it is. And because everyone is in agreement around you, you don't even give it a second thought. But a big part of this class is going to be questioning what you've learned, rethinking it, and even questioning what you're being taught in this class. It's always good to question, not just for the sake of questioning, not to be contrarian and to be devil's advocate and be trying to, undermine someone's argument, but really to get to the source of understanding, to get to the root of understanding something, right? To the source of information, to be able to comprehend and build a more full awareness or an understanding of the world, of life, of the past. So some questions to consider about history, and really, these are questions specifically about history, but you can actually expand them into, news stories, like I said, like scientific reports, anything that's being presented to you as nonfiction, as fact. Someone saying, these are the facts, and that's it. You gotta really ask some questions. So some questions to consider. Who tells it? Who is telling this story? There's the famous saying, right, is that the victors write history, right? Sorry, I just butchered it. It's not what it is. But there's the idea that it's the winners who get to tell the story. The quote-unquote winners, right? So whoever deems themselves the winners and those who are in charge get to control the narrative. And if, you can say this on a personal level too. If you've ever had someone try to tell your story of what happened, it can be very frustrating because people may misrepresent you. People may be telling the story based on their own agenda of what they want other people to believe. So when you're reading history, you have to ask, who's telling this story? And if somebody else who was living at the same time, from a different group, from a different perspective, was telling this, how would the story change? Right? And we have to always consider power. Power is a huge part of history. To be able to control the story is power, because it shapes the way that people view the situation, shapes then the choices that they will make in relation to things involved in the situation, right? And that therefore shapes the future. So George Orwell, wrote about this, I believe, in 1984, right? He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. So if you are in charge, you have power today in the present. You get to control how the story of the past is told. And if you get to control the story of how the past is told, you then shape the future based on what people believe, right? So who tells it is a huge thing, and in who gets to tell the story, you have to question, in that person telling the story, whose perspective is valued, whose point of view is valued, right? So if we say, like, okay, like, let's tell the story of the creation of the United States of America. If you are a person who idolizes George Washington and the founding fathers of the U.S., and you tell the story of the creation of the United States, and you're going to may value the perspective of those leaders, the people who wrote the founding documents and who started the revolution and who led the military. But in telling the story from just those people's perspective, you're showing that you don't quite care about those who didn't have power in that time period, those who may have been negatively impacted by the creation of the United States, those who who didn't have the freedom to record their histories, right? So if we're telling the story of the creation of the United States from the perspective of George Washington, again, it's going to be a very different story than if you tell the story of the American Revolution from one of his enslaved people, right? George Washington owned hundreds of slaves. Their story is probably going to be a little bit different, right? Knowing that the United States is being created and it's going to legalize slavery, it's going to be a different story. If you're going to have the story from the perspective of the, let's say, Iroquois Indians or the Syracuse Indians who are seeing their land being taken from them in order to create this new country, and then they choose to align with the King of England, they're going to have a very different story about George Washington and about the Founding Fathers, right? So you have to ask whose perspective is being valued in the story, who is included in the story, and who is then excluded. Then we get to the meaning of the story. Not like, oh, I read these words, what do they mean? No, no, no. When you take the whole story, what does this story mean? In the bigger, in the bigger ideas. Does this story mean that this country is a good country? Does this story mean that these people had the right to do this or that? Does this story mean that all the suffering of other people was acceptable for this outcome to occur? Does this mean that the bad things that happen to people are justifiable? Right? What does it mean? The bigger question, not like, what does this mean? George Washington crossed the river. Like, not like literally, what does it mean? What do the words say? But what is the bigger narrative that's being pushed or created or reinforced by this story? And so we have to think, why is the story being produced? What is the goal? So we think, it's been a big thing in the past 20 years, right? When I was going to school, Christopher Columbus was a hero. And to some segments of the population, he still is considered a hero. But I remember in 1992, which was the 500-year 500-year anniversary of, Columbus landing in the Americas in 1492, there were all these huge celebrations. But there were also huge protests from Native American nations who were challenging the idea of Columbus being a hero. And that's how he had been, there's monuments, more things are named after Columbus in the Americas than anyone else. Monuments to him everywhere. Kids do coloring pages. They learn about the 3 ships that he sailed in. All that stuff was like a part of my childhood. Maybe it is different now in many places. But you have to ask, why was that story pushed so hard? And there was a lot of myths around it, too, things that were completely untrue. Why were those myths created? Was it to validate the things that happened to Native Americans? Was it to make colonialism acceptable and a positive thing, right? You really have to ask, how is this story being used? Is it being used to convince people of something? Is it being used to sway them towards taking certain actions? Right? How is this story being used? And what are the actual actions and so then we have events that are coming out of where does the information about history that we have received come from? How have these stories been built? So I always like to share this image here, right, with the famous quote from Abraham Lincoln: "Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it." Famous, famous words of Abraham Lincoln from a speech that he made on the White House steps in 1863. It's like, no, of course not, right? But I put this up because, unfortunately, in our current world, in our current state of things, many people get their information and validate the information they've gotten from the internet, from memes. People like bite-sized pieces of information they can easily digest, and often if that information is not in conflict with things they already know, they're more likely to accept it. If it is presented just like in this format here, and I see this all the time, for some reason especially Albert Einstein quotes get misattributed all the time, or things are attributed to Albert Einstein that he never said. Like I've seen like poets who have been, had their lines attributed to the wrong people, authors, same thing. But if it's presented in this format, it will live on and be reposted into, eternity, and it's hard then to correct it. People only read headlines and captions instead of, oh yeah, I read that story. No, you didn't. You just read the headline. You read the caption or the picture. That's not the same as reading the story, right? But, in a fast-paced world, in a world where our attention spans have purposefully been shrunk down, and people are fidgety and they can't help but swipe on their phone, and you have unlimited options to distract you and occupy your attention. People are really not checking on where their information is coming from. I have students all the time, give quote unquote the internet as their source, as though if you saw it online, it must be true, which is a very scary, dangerous thing. We have all the misinformation politically that has gone out, socially that's gone out, and has created actual lived consequences for people. It's a dangerous thing. So a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, because you have people having a little bit of info on something and thinking they know the whole story, and then proceeding to move forward very confidently without checking. Where are the receipts for what you are, stating? Ask people what, you wouldn't just believe any bit of gossip, hopefully, that someone tells you without double checking. And you wouldn't want others to believe gossip about you without checking on the receipts. Like, where did this info come from? Who told you this? How do they know? Right? Were you there? You want to know those things to know if something is true or not. And it should be no different, whether it be gossip about you and your life, or drama about celebrities or this or that. And, history, the things that are told you as facts, news, science. So, to answer this question, where do historians get their information from? So, kind of very straightforward, let me give you this historical terminology here. There are two types of sources that historians use to construct their narratives of what happened in the past. First, historians use primary sources, and the word primary kind of means first, right? So these are first-hand pieces of evidence about an event, about an object, person, something you're writing about in history. So these are things that were created during the time of the event or time period or person's life that a historian is writing about. So primary sources can be, they're all kinds of things. Letters, news articles, photographs, birth certificates, diaries, interviews, menus, literal receipts, contracts, things that were created. So if you're studying, the Revolutionary War, the U.S. Revolution, they can be letters that people were writing to each other about the war. They can, during that time, they can be, a list of what supplies the Americans were gathering. They can be it can be a map of the stations of where the forces were lodging, right? Like, these are things created during that time, and now you're a historian, you want to tell the story of what happened during that time. You pull those things together and start to kind of create a story. But historians usually don't just use primary sources, because you take these things from that time period and you have to set them in context, meaning you have to understand what was the world like at that time. Like, what kinds of supplies generally did a military have? And, what was the landscape like at that time? Which towns had been established and which ones had not? What do I need to know about the leaders of the military at that time? So historians will not only use the primary sources from that time, they'll also then use secondary sources. And secondary sources are sources that have already written about the primary sources. They are, for example, textbooks, essays, articles, documentaries, things that were not created during the time of what you're studying, but they were written afterwards about your time. So if I was writing a story about a history about the American Revolutionary War, and I found a bunch of lists of people who were enslaved in a certain town that was important in the Revolutionary War, I would then probably read some articles, some essays about slavery during that period. I would probably read some, a textbook about that region of the United States during that period. I would read something about Native Americans, probably written after that time period by other experts, other people who have studied this stuff. So I would take the knowledge that other people have created, the secondary sources, and then I would take the evidence from that time, the primary sources, and then I would use those together to create a new history about the specific topic that I'm talking about. Okay, so primary sources are created during that time. Secondary sources are created after that time to write about the time period you're studying. So let's use these two terms and look at an actual document and see how we can better understand primary and secondary sources. Okay, so here, this document here, if you don't recognize it, is an important document in U.S. history. This is the Declaration of Independence. It was written by Thomas Jefferson, primarily, and it was signed by all these different leaders of all the different colonies at that time, fully signed by July 4th, 1776. And of course, that's USA's birthday. Right? Happy birthday, USA. Independence Day, because that's when the U.S. declared its independence on this document. This is a letter written in this time period of the American Revolution. Is this a primary source if we're studying the American Revolution? Yes, this is a primary source. This is from the time period of the American Revolution. It's by reading it, looking at even the way the words are written, which words they chose to include, who signed it and who didn't, right? Like all of these things, even like the type of paper, like people can study all kinds of things from this and gather information about that time period. Now, what if we, I want to study the Declaration of Independence, but I can't actually see the Declaration of Independence because it's under, armed guard in Washington, D.C. or whatever, right? It's in National Archives or wherever it's at. I can't actually see it, but I want to know what it says. I need the words in the Declaration of Independence. Well, then I can hop on the internet and I can Google Declaration of Independence text. And I will get a typed up version of the Declaration of Independence. It has all the same exact words. It's like, everything that's in that Declaration of Independence is typed out neatly for me to be able to read, because it's kind of hard to read that old-timey, feather quill writing. So here are the same exact words. This is the typed up exact words of this primary source document. Is this a primary source or is this a secondary source? This sometimes trips people up. This is a primary source. Why? It wasn't this version, this internet typed up version is not the same exact piece of paper as the Declaration of Independence. However, The information is exactly the same. And so because of that, I can study what these people were trying to say in the same exact way as if I read the primary source. The information has not changed. It has not been sent through someone else's perspective. It has not been interpreted. It has not been rewritten. This is still a primary source. So when you're studying the past, you don't actually have to see the actual document, the actual artifact, as long as what you are seeing conveys the same exact information. Now, I take the Declaration of Independence and let's say I go on my, Microsoft Word and I write up an essay. What did the Declaration of Independence mean to enslaved people? Let's say I write that essay. So now I'm taking this primary source and I'm interpreting and I'm saying what Thomas Jefferson really meant when he said all men are created equal is blah, blah, blah. And people at that time, especially those who were enslaved, saw that as a statement of blah, blah, blah. I'm talking about what the meaning of this primary source was to different people. So my essay explaining what the words in the Declaration of Independence means. Is that a primary source? I'm writing about something from that time period. I'm talking about the words from that time period. Is it a primary source or a secondary source? That is a secondary source because now the original words have been processed through another person. The meaning now is not the same. I am giving my own meaning to it. And so when you read a textbook and it's telling you the founding fathers wanted to do blah, blah, blah. How do you know that? That is just the author of that textbook interpreting, telling their own perspective of what they think the founding fathers meant by this document. Secondary source. It's been processed through somebody else. It's not from the original anymore. It's not like in a game of telephone, you have the original person say something, right? Like, your mom is funny looking. And then the next person hears that, and then they transfer it to the next person. Your mom looks funny. It's slightly different. It's been changed. It's been altered because it's gone through a different source. All right, that takes us to our first assignment for the class. And this is going to be a discussion post assignment. This is called discussion post number 1, and there are 2 questions in total. And I'm going to give you the questions right here on this video. And then you are going to respond to it on Canvas in the discussion post number 1. So based on all the, and your assignment your answers, your responses should only be based on the information given in this class, in the lecture videos, and in the future in any readings and videos that you are assigned. So only based on what you have consumed in terms of materials for this class and then how you have interpreted. You are making a secondary source in your response. Okay, so number 1, when you are reading nonfiction like history or let's say news or a scientific report, etc., based on this lecture, what questions should you ask yourself about what you're reading? So do refer to what you've learned in this lecture and list out the questions you should ask yourself about what you're reading. Right? So based on the lecture materials. Also, based on the lecture, why should you ask yourself these types of questions? So reflect on what you've learned. And in your response, you must use in meaningful or substantial ways the following terms: source, bias, and perspective.